sleeper 10. We only want to pass in the number of seconds the container should sleep, and the sleep command should be invoked automatically. And that is where the entry point instruction comes into play. The entry point instruction is like the command instruction, as in you can specify the program that will be run when the container starts. And whatever you specify on the command line, in this case 10, will get appended to the entry point. So the command that will be run when the container starts is sleep 10. So that's the difference between the two. In case of the CMD instruction, the command line parameters passed will get replaced entirely, whereas in case of entry point, the command line parameters will get appended. Now, in the second case, what if I run the Ubuntu sleeper image command without appending the number of seconds? Then the command at startup will be just sleep, and you get the error that the operand is missing. So how do you configure a default value for the command if one was not specified in the command line? That's where you would use both entry point as well as the command instruction. In this case, the command instruction will be appended to the entry point instruction. So at startup, the command would be sleep 5 if you didn't specify any parameters in the command line. If you did, then that will override the command instruction. And remember, for this to happen, you should always specify the entry point and command instructions in a JSON format. Finally, what if you really want to modify the entry point during runtime? Say, from sleep to an imaginary sleep 2.0 command. Well, in that case, you can override it by using the entry point option in the docker run command. The final command at startup would then be sleep 2.0 10. Well, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in the next. We now look at networking in Docker. When you install Docker, it creates 3 networks automatically: bridge, null, and host. Bridge is the default network a container gets attached to. If you would like to associate the container with any other network, you specify the network information using the network command line parameter like this. We will now look at each of these networks. The bridge network is a private internal network created by Docker on the host. All containers attached to this network by default, and they get an internal IP address, usually in the range 172.17 series. The containers can access each other using this internal IP if required. To access any of these containers from the outside world, map the ports of these containers to ports on the Docker host, as we have seen before. Another way to access the containers externally is to associate the container to the host network. This takes out any network isolation between the Docker host and the Docker container. Meaning, if you were to run a web server on port 5000 in a web app container, it is automatically accessible on the same port externally without requiring any port mapping, as the web container uses the host's network. This would also mean that, unlike before, you will now not be able to run multiple web containers on the same host on the same port, as the ports are now common to all containers in the host network. With the none network, the containers are not attached to any network and doesn't have any access to the external network or other containers. They run in an isolated network. So we just saw the default bridge network with the network ID 172.17.0.1. So all containers associated to this default network will be able to communicate to each other. But what if we wish to isolate the containers within the Docker host? For example, the first 2 web containers on internal network 172 and the second 2 containers on a different internal network, like 182. By default, Docker only creates one internal bridge network. We could create our own internal network using the command docker network create and specify the driver, which is bridge in this case, and the subnet for that network followed by the custom isolated network name. Run the docker network ls command to list all networks. So how do we see the network